Here is what I'm tying today. This is an articulated hair jig with lots of marabou, lots of rubber legs. It breathes really well, it undulates really well. I like fishing this hair jig really slowly and just giving these materials a lot of time to breathe. The fish really like it. And something a little different, this hair jig is articulated, which means there is a front and a rear hook in it. That just kind of that helps increase your hookup rates, and it allows us to kind of get the kind of look that I'm going for. I'm tying this on a NED, but you can use whatever jig head you like the best. I like NEDs because when it's paused and this hair jig is sticking straight up, it gives these materials the best possible room to really move really well. So to get started, for me, I'm going to be using a Gamakatsu SP11 in a size 8. Your rear hook is going to be determined by whatever jig head you're going to be using. So you can see with this one, the rear hook is slightly smaller than the front hook, and that's what you want to give yourself a nice taper in your hair jig. So we're going to start our thread. I'm using Veevus 140. And for the tail, I'm using Marble Fox. I like Marble Fox. It moves really well, and it's pretty cost effective. Just going to cut that on a slight taper just so this tying point isn't super bulky. And give yourself a lot of tight, strong thread wraps on this so this Arctic Fox isn't going anywhere. Next, we're going to be tying some polar reflector flash. You can also use UV polar chenille if that's what you have on hand, or if you don't want this hair jig to be as sparkly, you can just use schlappen. Next, we're going to come in with 2 pieces of schlappen tied in by the tips. And I want those tied concave side facing the hook shank. That'll make a little bit more sense in the next step. So get those locked in and advance your thread. Now you're going to grab your 2 pieces of schlappen and your polar reflector flash and kind of put it in that concave section right there and give the good twist. You can get a tool from Loon, which works really well. I don't know where mine is at the moment, so I'm doing it the old school way, which kind of stinks a little bit. So stop as you're doing this and you want to brush your materials out. You don't want any trap fibers. This entire hair jig is really meant just to breathe and move really well. So you want to get the maximum amount of all your materials. So once that's good and brushed out, start stroking them back and wrap them forward. You just want these wraps to be barely touching. Too many wraps and the materials will start to mat, and that kind of defeats the purpose of what we're doing here. And some are going to get trapped in. That's not a big deal. You can just brush that out when you're all done. And you want to stop about a hook eye length back on the shank to give you enough room to make a nice thread head and to tie in the rest of the materials. So get those nice and secured. Since you're using 2 pieces of schlappen and polar reflector flash right there, I really like to give those a lot of nice wraps to make sure everything is secure. And come in and brush this out. I like brushing out at each step, but you can also just do it at the end. I just think it's a little bit easier to do it step by step. And that's the other reason why I use a lot of thread wraps is when I'm spinning. When I'm using the rotary function on this vise, I always forget to whip finish to secure the thread so it doesn't unravel. But with a lot of tight thread wraps, if you unravel a few wraps, it doesn't really matter. So the next step is we're going to come in with some rubber legs. I tie 2 down each side. I keep these things full length, again, just to give myself a lot of materials that will move when you're fishing this hair jig. So tie 2 down each side. Make sure you're pulling tension on your your rubber legs and on your thread to really secure those in well so they don't move around. Get those nice and locked in. So that's done. Now I'll come in with I like an off color piece of schlappen for this one, or kind of the main color what I'm going for. This one I want to be a lot of yellows and reds. Those seem to be an effective color for me this year. So let's wrap that forward. You don't need a lot of wraps, maybe 2 or 3 for this first part. If you get a rubber leg in there, just let go of it. And now that should be good. This is a nice piece of schlappen, so make sure you keep this. To make sure I'm going to keep this, that way I can use it again on a next step on the next hook. So that's done. And you're just going to lock your thread in place with whatever knot and glue you like to use. I like to use S.O.L, but there's a lot of stuff you can use. Cure that head. You could probably fish this just by itself. You can throw that with a fly rod, or I bet jigging that for a walleye on a walleye fly setup would do really well, but that's not what we're doing today. So next, come in with whatever jig head you're going to be using. Like I said, I'm using a NED. This one's a 1/4 ounce. And bring your thread back. I'm going to bring my thread back down the bend just a little bit more than you typically do. I find that helps keep these hair jigs with the NEDs from fouling too much. To tie on my rear hook to the front hook, I'm going to be using 40-pound braid. Just get that looped in like this. You don't have to make sure the tips are exactly alike. And then give myself a little bit of space. I'm using a single double E bead. These are just glass beads, just the cheap ones you get at Michael's. You don't have to go fancy. Like I said, this rear hook is gonna go in the opposite direction as the front hook. It's called death trap. It's kind of a way for single hook people are tying to kind of make a treble. So there's always kind of a hook there for the fish to get hung up on. And we don't need a lot of room with this one. What I mean by that is that's this space here. You really don't need much. You hardly need any at all, because this is going to move really well. And you don't want that thing fouling. So just hardly any. You can still see it moves really easily. And now bring your thread forward. When you bring your thread forward and back, you want to make crisscross wraps like this, so that when the fish hits the rear hook and starts pulling on it, the wraps will tighten in on themselves. If you take a hair clip, you can do it so the hook's out of the way, so when you're stroking your materials back, you're not going to get yourself hooked as many times on that trailer hook, which it is going to happen. So bring that forward and bring it back and just wrap a bunch of wraps on there in the crisscross method to get this really secured in there. You can use super glue here, but I think with these thread wraps, you really don't need to. And now I'm going to reposition this jig in my vise properly. I just bring it up a little bit when I'm tying in the trailer hook to give myself a little bit more room. But if your vise, you don't need to do that. That's a step you can skip. So now we're going to stop our thread about in between the hook point and the barb of the hook. And we're going to come back with our, where did I put it? We're going to come back in with our UV polar flash and repeat the same steps as we did last time. To give yourself a nice taper, I'm probably going to choose marabou that's a little bit longer. So these feathers will be longer in the front than they will in the back. So everything kind of gives yourself a nice teardrop look when everything is wet. I'm not super picky if these feathers and the hackle and everything aren't the same length. I think it looks better when they're a little bit more different anyways. Gives it less of a painted look. Maybe a little bit more organic, but fish have really small brains. Again, do the same thing. Match those and pinch them together and just start spinning. Like I said, Loon's got a great tool. I just don't know where mine is at the moment. And we're going to stop wrapping this just behind the material keeper. So just wrap this forward, stroking your fibers back, trying not to get too many stuck, but you will get a few. It's not a big deal. So get that nice and secured in there. Wrap back over itself. And now you can see this is kind of nonsense. So you're going to come in here and really brush this out. We're taking a lot of time to tie a hair jig, so you might as well tie it the way it's supposed to be. That looks pretty good. Now we're going to come in with our yellow piece of schlappen we used on the rear hook. And we're going to use the rest of this up. And wrap that. Do 1 or 2 wraps behind the material keeper, and then we're going to do the rest in front of it. And you're going to want to make sure you pull back on this thread, on these next wraps, to make sure you go underneath the space for the material keeper. That's pretty good. Let's get that nice and secured. And bring your thread all the way to the front. For these next few steps, I like tying all my materials in right next to the jig head. Sometimes when you're tying in here, you can get a space between your material and your jig head. And that kind of leads to a less secure tying point. It might allow your materials to shift. So we're trying to avoid that. So we're going to come in with 4 sets of rubber legs this time. You can use as many or as less as you want. You could also probably just tie a skirt here, but I just find that kind of boring. Same thing, lots of tension. Tie it down the side. Flip it over. Tie in the other side. And really get those nice and secured. Now for the collar, we're going to use 2 colors of marabou. Just grab those. We're going to tie those by the tips. And we're going to tie it all the way forward to the jig head. Get these ready. You can also twist these together like we have been doing with the schlappen and the UV polar chenille, but I think this works out a little bit better. I think it just looks better, but that's just me. Again, this might get all kind of ugly looking, but we'll be fixing this at the end. It doesn't matter if you do one color first or one color second, it's going to look pretty much identical in the end. Now just wrap these forward. Again, we're not paying a whole lot of mind to the fact that this looks kind of like a minefield right now. That's kind of what we're looking for. This marabou is going to kind of act like a skirt. It's going to give a lot of movement with, you know, not a lot of current or not a lot of action imparted on it. So you really want nice long pauses on this to give the fish time to get a look at it and then get fooled. So wrap back and secure that. Brush these materials out. You can see that once you start brushing this all comes together really nicely. And for the last step, we're going to be using another piece of schlappen. This time we're going to be tying it in by the tips. This is a shorter piece of schlappen. I want some longer fibers in here, so that's why we're doing it this way for this part. And you want maybe 3 or 4 wraps, kind of depends on how dense the fibers are on your schlappen. But that looks about right there. So get that nice and secured. Give this hair jig a try. You can downsize this. You can upsize it. You can upside this big enough to, with a little slightly different tweaks, you can upsize this enough to fish for pike and muskie if you want. You just need a slightly different materials and jig hook and rear hook, but it gets the job done. So whip finish and apply your glue. Secure that glue with some white. Get it nice and dry. And that's it. It's totally excessive. It's way too much work for a hair jig that you're probably gonna lose, but it's fish catching capabilities and fun of fishing makes it well worth it. So give it a try, and I will see you next time.